A conventional definition of justice defines justice as a balance. It's a fair distribution of goods to multiple groups or different people. So, an easy way to visualize this basic definition of justice is to consider a scale. Now, on each side of the scale, the things are balanced. What one side has is balanced out because the other side has the same amount. So, to visualize this further, we can imagine that one side of the scale represents one person and the other side represents another. Now, in order for the scale to remain balanced, whatever person one gains, well, person two has to gain it as well. So, for example, if person one gains job opportunities, for the scale to stay balanced, person two has to have those same job opportunities. The same goes for many other factors, such as property or social status. For justice to be maintained, the scales must be balanced. Now, to view this on a more microscopic level, we can consider the application of justice to America. Now, specifically, we consider the justice preserved or not preserved between two groups of people, Black Americans and white Americans. Now, unfortunately, when considering how these two groups have been treated throughout American history, it actually hasn't been akin to this balanced scale. It's been white Americans who have gotten more and more, and Black Americans who have gotten less. Now, a quote by Charles Mills in The Racial Contract aptly describes this lack of balance or lack of justice. Charles Mills writes, "When white people say justice, they mean just us." Now, a better way that we can envision justice in America is a tipped scale. It's been tipped in favor of whites because white Americans have been given more and more opportunities, leaving Black Americans with less. Now, when we have the scales tipped in this direction and this lack of balance, it's truly not justice at all. Now, to understand how and why this has occurred throughout American history, we have to start in 1619, because that's when the first slaves were brought to the Americas. Now, slaves in America were treated absolutely horribly. They were torn away from their families, and many were subjected to grueling labor on American plantations. Now, unfortunately, this labor and this brutal treatment of African Americans directly led to the economic prosperity of whites. As slave labor was used to produce cotton and other goods, this allowed white Americans to profit. Thus, as time passed and slavery became more and more frowned upon, white Americans were left with a dilemma because the abolition of slavery would mean the abolition of slave labor as well. This would mean a huge cut in profit for many white Americans. So when the 13th Amendment came out, which is widely credited with abolishing slavery, there was a very important caveat in the wording of this amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime. Now, what this means is that criminals, or people who have been imprisoned can be used to provide prison labor, which is essentially a legalized or just form of slave labor. So an early form of this imprisonment to fuel prison labor can be seen through convict leasing. Now, this occurred in the Reconstruction era, and what this meant is that prisoners could essentially be leased out to corporations to provide free labor and allow these corporations to profit. We've seen the horrible continuation of prison labor into modern times, and the way that this often occurs now is that Black Americans are imprisoned at a rate that's disproportionate to whites. So Black Americans are disproportionately providing this prison labor and allowing these white corporations to profit. Now, many policies are responsible for this disparity in the rates of imprisonment. Now, an example of a policy is the war on drugs, which claimed to aim to lessen drug use in America. However, throughout the war on drugs, many more Black Americans were arrested than white Americans. Now, this is largely due to the differing policies with the drug cocaine. As an example, crack cocaine was very prevalent among Black communities, and the repercussions for being found to be using or selling crack cocaine were significantly worse than those if you were using powder cocaine, which is a drug found in white communities. So that's a clear example of how the same drug differed in repercussion based on who was using it. Now, other policies have continued into our modern day. An example is three-strike laws, which ensure that if someone has been arrested 3 times for drug-related crimes, then they're sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. There's also mandatory minimum sentences for certain drug crimes. Now, all of these policies have caused more and more Black Americans to go into prison, provide this prison labor, and allow white Americans to profit from this. Now, in our modern day, 35% of the prison population is Black Americans, while Black Americans only make up 15% of the general population. It's clear that those rates simply do not line up. And when it's all lined up like this, it's fairly recognizable that Black Americans have been treated horribly and have been used to fuel the profits of white Americans. However, this is not the way that the general public has come to view Black and white Americans. Instead, throughout the course of history, there's been widespread deception for this inequality. Put more eloquently, white people have found different ways to justify this injustice. Throughout history, Black Americans have been painted in a very negative light, and white Americans have been painted in a much better light. Now, this can trace all the way back to Plato's noble lot. As a way to explain why different people in society are of different classes, why some people have a higher class and some people are of a lower class, well, Plato stated that it's because people have different metal in their blood. Plato stated that if you have gold in your blood, you're destined to be a ruler, silver, you're destined to be an auxiliary, and bronze, you're destined to be a craftsman. So this is a clear early example of Plato justifying inequality and inequity by stating that some were inherently superior to others. Now, for white Americans or the leaders at this time, they could justify their higher social status by saying that they had gold in their blood. Now, this has completely continued into our modern day, and an example of how Black Americans have been painted in this negative light can be understood by the association between Blackness and criminality. Now, for example, a movie called Birth of a Nation was released in 1915 in America. This film most notably depicted a Black man as a dangerous rapist who was to be very feared. Notably, everyone loved this film and it was widely admired. Now, the propaganda and the ideals propagated by this film suggested to society again and again that a Black man is someone who's scary and he's someone who's dangerous. Now, the effects of this ideology were very negative. For example, this film led to a revitalization of the Ku Klux Klan. Another example of is the trial of the Scottsboro boys. 9 boys were convicted of allegedly raping 2 white women, and they faced conviction after conviction by jury after jury, even though there was virtually no evidence that they actually committed the rape. Furthermore, one of the women even came forward and stated that she made it all up. Now, again, in modern times, this has translated into how we recognize criminals. Now, again, as a reminder, Black Americans are imprisoned at a rate disproportionate to whites, and the way we view criminals is as though they're lesser than us, and that it's okay that they get this lesser treatment by society. For example, if you have a crime on your record, it's extremely difficult to get a job, it's extremely difficult to apply for housing, it's difficult to gain respect, sometimes you lose the right to vote. Overall, this can be understood as the social death of a felon. Now, for white Americans, what this means in turn is that they have access to more jobs, they have more say in the vote, and they have more opportunities. Overall, this depiction can be understood as association between Blackness and criminality. Now, throughout what we've seen in American history, it's very clear that white Americans have had social, economic, and political advantages. Thus, when looking at how these scales can ever be evened out and how justice can be provided, it's a daunting task. In 2020, Kimberly Jones phrased this very well. She stated, with all of the history of inequity that we've seen, how can you win? How can Black Americans win? The short answer is that there's a lot that needs to be done. First of all, there needs to be a widespread acknowledgement of the historical white privilege that's occurred. Schools throughout the nation need to teach children about the history of slavery and its entirety and how white people have and continue to benefit from the provisions of slavery. Furthermore, there need to be reparations for slavery. This is a debt that's long overdue. There needs to be free healthcare. Black Americans have been economically disadvantaged for years. This is a matter of life and death for some people. There should be equal opportunity hiring and affirmative action to ensure that both education and jobs are equitably distributed to all groups of people, including and especially Black Americans. There needs to be eradication of these discriminatory policies that includes truth in sentencing, mandatory minimum sentences, and three-strike laws. And of course, there needs to be an end to the police brutality that we're seeing in modern day. Police need to be better trained and vetted to ensure that Black Americans are not being killed by the people who are supposed to protect them. Overall, it's very apparent that because the scales of justice have been tipped in this way for so long, it's going to take a lot before they can be evened out. It's going to take years of change and new policies before we can ever even out these scales. But if and when we're able to do so, that's when we'll have true justice.